The air was not just heavy, it was suffocating, poisoned by a stench so vile that even England's hardest, most battle-tested courtiers gagged, doubled over, and scrambled for the nearest windows. What they smelled wasn't simply decay, it was corruption. The body of a king so rotten that even in death he defiled the air of his own palace. Outside, the scene descended from royal dignity to something out of a nightmare. Stray dogs prowled the courtyards, tongues lapping at the foul black fluid seeping from cracks in the coffin of King Henry VIII. Think about that for a moment. The monarch who called himself God's anointed, the man who bent an entire church to his will, reduced to carrion for dogs? And tonight, we are diving deep into the true, unvarnished medical horror story of Henry VIII. The shocking truth of how England's golden Renaissance prince transformed into a swollen, pus-soaked monster of nearly 400 pounds. A truth that Tudor officials buried, locked away, and silenced for almost 5 centuries. Because what you were taught in school about Henry's decline, it was a lie, carefully polished, whitewashed, and stripped of the stinking reality. This isn't guesswork. This isn't tabloid history. What I'm about to reveal comes from suppressed physician notes, eyewitness diaries, and forensic evidence ripped straight from the king's diseased remains. But before we get to the grotesque explosion of Henry's corpse, before we get to the dogs feasting on royal fluids, we need to step back. Because the horror that killed Henry wasn't sudden. It was a slow-motion catastrophe that began with a single, catastrophic impact. A moment so violent, it changed not just Henry's body, not just his mind, but the fate of England itself. And if you think you know this story, think again. Because I've got 3 revelations coming that will utterly rewrite your picture of Henry VIII and the Tudor dynasty. Believe me, you've never heard this version before. So do me a favor. If this hidden history is already blowing your mind, hit that like button right now. Not only does it help other history fanatics uncover these suppressed truths, but it makes sure you don't miss what's coming. Because the story we're about to unravel isn't just history, it's horror. And it all starts on a cold January day in a tilt yard trembling with the thunder of hooves.
January 24th, 1536, Greenwich Palace. The crowd had gathered, shivering in the winter cold, but hearts blazing with anticipation. This wasn't just sport. This was spectacle. The King of England himself taking the field, a monarch still young enough to command awe, still fit enough to play the part of Europe's most dazzling prince, Henry VIII. 44 years old, towering above his peers, wrapped in armor so lavish that each piece was worth more than a commoner's lifetime wages. His warhorse, bred for battle and destruction, stamped and snorted under him, muscles rippling like iron cables. Even in middle age, Henry remained a force of nature, the living embodiment of power and glory. The tilt yard fell silent as Henry lowered his lance. The air trembled with the thunder of hooves. Across the field, another armored knight surged forward, lance gleaming, ready to meet his king head-on. Then, catastrophe. The collision was catastrophic, a visceral shock like the crunch of steel in a modern car crash. The horses smashed together, the world erupted in chaos, and Henry, all 300 pounds of steel and flesh, was thrown like a rag doll into the frozen ground. The gasp of thousands ripped the air as the king's colossal warhorse stumbled, faltered, and in a grotesque twist of fate, crashed down directly on top of him. Silence. A silence so total, it was as though England itself held its breath. Courtiers froze. Ladies screamed and fainted. Man gripped the railings, too terrified to move. Had England just lost its king, its future, its very stability to a sport? For 2 agonizing hours, Henry lay motionless, unconscious, lifeless. Think about that. 2 full hours where England had no king, no monarch, no voice at the helm. 2 hours when Anne Boleyn, heavily pregnant with the child she believed would secure her future, waited in terror, unsure if her unborn son had already lost the throne. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, Henry stirred. The crowd leaned in. Courtiers whispered prayers of thanks. The king was alive. But when Henry's eyes opened, they were not the same. Witnesses reported something profoundly chilling. Gone was the bright spark of wit, the charisma, the radiant confidence that had once charmed all Europe. What stared back at them was different, darker, harder. A new light flickered there, one of rage, suspicion, and volatility. His first words weren't gratitude, nor reassurance. They were fury. He demanded to know why the joust had been stopped. And in that moment, the Golden Prince, who had written poetry, played music, debated philosophy, and danced until dawn, was gone. In his place stood a man fractured. Modern neuroscientists have pored over these accounts, and the evidence is chilling. Henry's skull, smashed against the frozen round, likely suffered a traumatic brain injury. And not just any injury, a blow to the frontal lobe, the very part of the brain that governs judgment, impulse control, and personality. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Before 1536, Henry had shown restraint rare for a monarch of his time. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for 20 years before seeking an annulment. His executions of nobles were measured, controlled. In fact, fewer than many of his predecessors. But after that fall, everything changed. 4 months later, Anne Boleyn was dragged to the scaffold. Thomas Cromwell, the man who had shaped Henry's very government, would soon follow. Courtiers began to whisper of a king who could weep uncontrollably one moment, then explode into murderous rage the next. England was no longer ruled by a Renaissance prince. It was ruled by a tyrant with a broken mind. But the head injury was only the beginning, because that same day, that same catastrophic fall tore open a wound on Henry's leg. A wound that would never heal. A wound that would rot him alive from the inside out. And it is here, my friends, that our story twists from tragedy into absolute body horror.
The jousting accident didn't just bruise a king's body, it cracked open his soul. What rose from the ground that day was not the Henry England had known, but a man who would rule in suspicion, cruelty, and paranoia for the rest of his reign. Before 1536, Henry VIII was not the monster we remember. In his youth, he was celebrated as the very image of Renaissance virtue, a king who wrote love songs, debated theology with scholars, and dazzled ambassadors with his charm and intellect. His early reign was marked by stability, even generosity. Executions were rare. The court sparkled with optimism. But after Greenwich, everything shifted. Eyewitnesses began whispering of Henry's sudden mood swings. One moment he would laugh, joke, and pour wine for his companions. The next, his face would darken, his temper would snap like a trap, and courtiers would find themselves facing accusations of treason over the smallest slight. It was as though the fall had awakened something primal in him, something savage.
And the first to pay the price was Anne Boleyn. Anne, Henry's great passion, the queen for whom he had broken with Rome and torn an entire church from the Pope's grasp, now found herself walking on a knife's edge. Her once flirtatious husband now saw betrayal in every gesture. Every courtier who so much as smiled at her was eyed with suspicion. Then came the miscarriages. In January 1536, just days after Henry's accident, Anne miscarried a son. The son she had promised him would secure the Tudor dynasty. For a man already spiraling into paranoia, it was the breaking point. Within months, Anne was accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft, charges so grotesque they bordered on absurd. Yet Henry did not hesitate. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold at the Tower of London. She looked out across the sea of faces, searching perhaps for mercy in her husband's eyes. But Henry did not attend. He was already celebrating his engagement to Jane Seymour. This was the new Henry, swift, merciless, capable of discarding wives, friends, and ministers alike with chilling ease. Even Thomas More, once Henry's closest confidant, had fallen beneath the blade for refusing to endorse his supremacy over the church. Now, no one was safe. Thomas Cromwell, architect of Henry's break with Rome, the man who had engineered Anne's downfall, soon found his own head on the block. Why? Because Henry's suspicion knew no loyalty, no limit, no boundary. And as the years dragged on, the king's paranoia deepened. Courtiers learned to read his moods as if their lives depended on it, because they did. A misplaced word, a slow bow, a sideways glance, and suddenly you could find yourself in the Tower, condemned by whispers. This was no longer the laughing, athletic monarch of Europe's admiration. This was a man consumed by fear, by rage, and by a body betraying him from within. Because while Henry's mind grew darker, his body was waging a war of its own. That wound on his leg, the one ripped open in the joust, refused to heal. It festered, it swelled, and it began to rot. At first, physicians treated it with poultices and ointments, believing it would close in time. But instead, the injury deepened, tunneling into his flesh, a constant abscess that oozed pus and blood. The smell alone became a legend at court, a sickly, sweet, rotting stench that perfumed the royal chambers. And with every passing year, the pain twisted Henry's mind tighter and tighter. He could no longer joust, no longer hunt with the same vigor, no longer dance through the night. His pride, his power, his very identity as the virile King of England slipping away. So, he lashed out at friends, at wives, at the nation itself. And it would only get worse, because the wound wasn't just festering, it was spreading. And what it would do to Henry's body over the next decade is almost too grotesque to imagine. By the 1540s, Henry was no longer merely a tyrant. He was a monster of flesh and rot. And in the next chapter, we'll peel back the bandages, literally, to uncover the full medical horror of Henry VIII's ulcerated, gangrenous legs.
By the early 1540s, the once golden prince of Europe was unrecognizable. His waistline had swelled past 50 inches. His face had grown blotchy, swollen, and waxy. But nothing horrified his courtiers more than the state of his legs. That wound from the joust never healed. Instead, it metastasized into a living nightmare. A pair of ulcerated, pus-filled craters that refused to close, erupting day after day with foul-smelling discharge. Imagine being a court physician called to the royal bedchamber at dawn.
The king, unable to sleep from the agony, lies snarling on his pillows, sheets soaked in sweat and blood. You kneel at his side. The moment you lift the bandages, the air is ripped open by a stench so powerful it clings to your clothes for hours. It is the odor of rotting meat, of sweet, sickly decay, the stench of death itself. Every morning, Henry's surgeons were forced to slice into his legs, probing deep into the ulcers to release the pus. Some days they used red-hot irons to cauterize the flesh. Other days they stuffed the wounds with lint, herbs, and even honey, desperately trying to soak up the filth. But nothing worked. The ulcers always returned, always oozed, always rotted. Eyewitnesses wrote that the king screamed in agony, his booming voice echoing down the stone halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court. Courtiers waiting outside could hear his cries, a daily reminder that their monarch was rotting alive in the next room. The smell was so overpowering that foreign ambassadors complained of it in letters home. Perfumes were burned constantly in the royal chambers, not out of vanity, but out of sheer necessity to mask the nauseating odor that clung to the king's body. Yet in portraits, Henry appears pristine, majestic, untouched. His legs hidden beneath silks and armor, his enormous frame rendered not as grotesque, but commanding. These paintings were not reality. They were propaganda, a desperate attempt to conceal the truth that England's king was becoming a prisoner of his own flesh. And the ulcers weren't just disgusting, they were deadly. Modern doctors believe Henry suffered from chronic osteomyelitis, a bone-deep infection. Each time the ulcers opened, bacteria surged into his bloodstream, poisoning him from within. Infections flared again and again, leaving him feverish, delirious, and unpredictable. And when the pain hit hardest, when the fever gripped him, Henry lashed out with savage fury. His courtiers never knew when the storm would break. One moment, the king might speak kindly, almost warmly. The next, he could explode into a murderous rage, accusing even his closest allies of treason. This wasn't just politics. This was biology. Henry's brain was drowning in toxins from his rotting legs. His body was fueling his tyranny. And as his ulcers worsened, so too did his appetites. He could no longer exercise, no longer joust, no longer hunt. The athletic prince of his youth was gone. In his place was a man who drowned his despair in food and drink. Roasted meats, flagons of ale, mountains of pastries, all devoured by a king who could barely waddle across a chamber without assistance. By the mid-1540s, Henry's bulk had ballooned to nearly 400 pounds. His legs could barely carry him. Special hoists and machinery had to be installed in his palaces to lift him onto his horse, into his bed, even onto the toilet. The once dazzling prince had become a grotesque spectacle, and yet he demanded worship. No one was allowed to acknowledge the reality. Courtiers bowed deeper, spoke more carefully, and praised the very body that disgusted them. But they could not ignore the truth forever, because soon Henry's ulcers would worsen into something beyond even medical horror. They would become gangrene, black, festering death spreading through his limbs. And when that moment came, Henry's body wouldn't just fail him, it would betray him in the most grotesque way imaginable.
By the last decade of his life, Henry VIII was no longer just a king. He was a spectacle of flesh, fury, and fear. The handsome Renaissance prince of 1510, who once turned heads across Europe, had swollen into a monstrous caricature of himself. At his peak, Henry tipped the scales at nearly 400 pounds. His chest expanded like a barrel. His belly hung low, sagging over his belt. His face, once striking and regal, was bloated,
veined and waxy, his small eyes glimmering with both pain and suspicion. He had become, quite literally, larger than life, a human fortress of fat and disease, terrifying to behold, yet impossible to look away from. But don't be fooled. This wasn't the comfortable obesity of a man growing old in luxury. This was pathological. Every ounce of weight magnified his suffering. His legs, ulcerated, gangrenous, and riddled with infection, struggled under the crushing burden. He could barely stand, let alone walk. Palaces were retrofitted for him. Mechanical hoists were installed to lift his immense frame onto his horse, into his bed, and even onto the royal privy. Great reinforced chairs had to be built to support him. The most powerful man in England was now utterly dependent on servants to move his bulk from room to room. And as his body collapsed, his mind unraveled. The Henry of his youth had been magnetic, laughing, witty, endlessly charming. But the obese, pain-ridden Henry of the 1540s was something else entirely. He had become paranoid to the point of delusion. He trusted no one, not his wives, not his ministers, not even his own children. At night, racked with fever, sweating from the poisons coursing through his infected body, Henry raved in his chambers. Servants reported hearing him shouting at shadows, arguing with invisible enemies, cursing ghosts that only he could see. Some nights he screamed the names of those he had executed as though they had returned to haunt him. Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Jane Seymour. His enemies, his lovers, his friends, all paraded through his feverish hallucinations. And his paranoia bled into policy. He ordered the execution of nobles on flimsy charges, terrified of conspiracies that may never have existed. Whole families were destroyed because Henry, in his delusional terror, imagined betrayal where there was none. Wives, too, suffered under his instability. Anne of Cleves was discarded almost immediately, humiliated in front of Europe. Catherine Howard, barely more than a teenager, was beheaded for adultery, though in truth she was likely a victim of abuse long before Henry ever met her. His final wife, Catherine Parr, lived in constant fear, narrowly escaping arrest for her reformist sympathies. The king who once dazzled Europe as a cultured prince had become a grotesque tyrant, both physically and psychologically monstrous. He could command the loyalty of armies, yet he could not command his own body. He could tear nations apart with a signature, yet he could not silence the screams of his own infected flesh. And by the winter of 1546, his decline accelerated. He spent most days immobile, propped up by cushions, roaring orders at terrified ministers. His enormous meals, once a sign of indulgence, now turned against him, worsening his gout, his diabetes, his ulcers, his every ailment. And as the new year dawned, the king who had once been Europe's most dazzling monarch was reduced to a suffering, swollen husk. His courtiers whispered in the corridors that God himself was punishing Henry, not just for his sins against his wives, not just for the rivers of blood he had spilled, but for daring to call himself God's equal on earth. Because now, Henry's body was no longer just failing, it was rotting. Black gangrene was creeping through his legs, poisoning his blood, shutting down his organs. His screams of pain shook the palace walls, and soon, very soon, they would be silenced.
By the end of 1546, the king who had once been hailed as England's golden prince was now little more than a grotesque shadow of humanity. His body, swollen and corrupted, was in open revolt against itself. The ulcers on his legs, those gaping, stinking wounds that had plagued him since the fateful joust of 1536, had entered their final stage. The pus, once yellowish and merely foul, had darkened to sickly green and brown. Now the flesh around them blackened and crumbled, unmistakable signs of gangrene. The smell was indescribable, a miasma of decay that clung to every corridor of Whitehall Palace. Even his most loyal servants could barely endure it. Men fainted when changing his bandages. Women vomited after only moments in his chamber. Courtiers who had once flocked to bask in his presence now dreaded audiences with him, holding pomanders of herbs to their noses and praying they could escape quickly. Henry himself knew. He could feel it. He was being eaten alive by his own flesh. And yet, his pride, that vast, unyielding pride that had once torn a kingdom from the Pope's grip, would not allow him to admit defeat. He raged at his physicians, demanding miracle cures, promising mountains of gold if they could halt the rot. But medicine had no such miracle. His doctors could only drain, clean, wrap, and hope, rituals as useless as they were humiliating. As the gangrene spread, so too did Henry's mind unravel further. He began to hallucinate with terrifying regularity. At first, he spoke to his dead parents, Henry VIII and Elizabeth of York, arguing over his failures and deaths. Then he raved at the ghosts of his wives. Anne Boleyn mocked him from the shadows. Catherine of Aragon, abandoned and betrayed, turned away from his cries for forgiveness. Young Catherine Howard taunted him with the innocence he had stolen. Even during council meetings, he would suddenly freeze, his massive face turning pale, his swollen hands trembling, as if seeing someone no one else could. Then he would erupt into fury, shouting commands at empty air, calling for executions of men long dead. Courtiers sat petrified, too afraid to correct him, too terrified to acknowledge the king's madness. By Christmas to 1546, England itself was governed by whispers and fear. Ministers operated in secret, avoiding the king's wrath when possible, bending to it when unavoidable. Pages developed a secret system to warn of his moods: red ribbons for rage, black for despair, white for rare moments of calm. But calm was nearly extinct. Henry's body ballooned beyond anything seen in royal memory. His waistline reached 54 inches, wider than some of the thrones he sat upon. He could barely breathe without wheezing. His tongue swelled, his words slurred into wet, gurgling growls. His urine turned black, his belly distended with fluid, pressing against his lungs, suffocating him slowly. The mighty King of England was now a diseased carcass that hadn't yet stopped moving. And then came the final betrayal: his brain. The toxins from his rotting legs flooded his bloodstream, seeping into his mind. The man who had once written love songs, debated theology, and charmed ambassadors could no longer think clearly. He drifted between brief flashes of lucidity, begging for salvation, demanding more food, ordering impossible cures, and long stretches of delirium. He would call for his mother, for his brother Arthur, for the children he had lost. He sobbed openly in front of servants, an unbearable sight from a king who had once styled himself as God's lion on earth. At other times, he shrieked in terror, pointing at the floor, crying out about flames and demons clawing their way from beneath his bed. Those final weeks were a theater of suffering. The courtiers whispered that God himself had struck Henry down, rotting him alive as punishment for his sins. Some said it was vengeance for the monasteries he had destroyed, for the wives he had executed, for the faith he had defied. Others simply prayed the nightmare would end before England itself unraveled under the weight of its king's grotesque decline. And yet, through it all, Henry clung stubbornly to life, refusing to surrender, refusing to admit weakness, determined to command, even as his body betrayed him. But his reign of terror was nearly at its end, because in January 1547, the monster that Henry had become would face his final agony. and England would face the unthinkable, the death of a king who could not die with dignity.
January 1547, Whitehall Palace. The once mighty Lion of England lay collapsed upon his bed, surrounded not by soldiers or courtiers, but by the stench of rotting flesh and the whispers of terrified servants. Henry VIII, who had broken a nation from Rome, who had commanded armies and reshaped Christendom, was now a swollen carcass barely clinging to life. His legs, consumed by gangrene, oozed streams of foul fluid. His abdomen swelled monstrously, pressing on his lungs until every breath came as a tortured gasp. His tongue filled his mouth, swollen and purple, twisting his words into incomprehensible groans. The king who once ruled with thunderous speeches could no longer ask for water without drowning in his own saliva. And yet even as his body betrayed him, his mind convulsed between lucidity and madness. On January 20th, physicians observed the unmistakable signs of multiple organ failure. His kidneys produced only dribbles of dark brown urine stinking of ammonia. His liver collapsed under the strain of infection, his skin turning the jaundiced yellow of a corpse still barely alive. His heart, once described by physicians as swollen and waterlogged, thudded unevenly in his chest. But worse than the physical collapse were the visions. In the fevered hours of night, Henry screamed for his dead children, the miscarriages and stillbirths that haunted his line. He begged them to forgive him, promising he would be a better father if they returned. He cried out for his brother Arthur, dead since boyhood, confessing that he had stolen both his throne and his bride. He pleaded with Catherine of Aragon to absolve him for casting her aside. And most pitifully, he begged Anne Boleyn, the wife he had condemned to the scaffold, to stop laughing at him from the shadows. Those who attended him swore the king argued with phantoms in his chamber. He barked orders at invisible enemies, raged at empty chairs, wept in the silence between hallucinations. His chamber became a theater of ghosts and Henry its terrified, decaying actor. Then, on January 27, the nightmare reached its peak. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to provide the king's last rites. When he entered the chamber, what he witnessed was so horrific he would never record it openly, only in the secret pages of his diary discovered centuries later. The scene was apocalyptic. 6 strong men struggled to hold Henry down as violent seizures racked his massive body. His bedframe, specially reinforced for his weight, cracked beneath the convulsions. Foam and black bile poured from his lips. His swollen face contorted in grotesque spasms. The very room reeked of vomit and decay. Between seizures, Henry vomited clots of dark blood, his insides hemorrhaging in a final rebellion. The sound of his breathing changed, the wet, rattling gasps known today as the death rattle, fluid flooding his lungs, drowning him slowly as his organs failed one by one. Archbishop Cranmer approached the king, trembling, holding his bloated hand. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "if you trust in Christ for salvation, give me a sign." Henry's eyes rolled back, unfocused, his jaw slackened, drool pooling on his chin. Then, with what little strength remained in that titanic, rotting body, Henry squeezed the archbishop's hand once, weakly, and then his grip fell slack. At 2:07 a.m., January 28, 1547, the infamous king in English history died, not peacefully as official records claimed, not surrounded by glory, hymns, or dignity, but screaming, convulsing, drowning in his own fluids, tormented by the ghosts of those he had destroyed. Henry VIII, the Golden Prince, the tyrant, the monster, was no more. But even death would not free England from his stench, for the horror was only beginning. His corpse would betray him in ways so vile, so obscene, that his government would bury the truth for centuries. Because Henry VIII was about to stage his most grotesque performance yet, the rotting of a king before the eyes of his nation.
When the swollen, wheezing corpse of Henry VIII finally gave its last convulsion in the early hours of January 28, 1547, his attendants breathed with relief. The terror of his reign and the horror of his dying days seemed to be over. But in truth, the nightmare had only just begun. For no sooner had the king's soul departed than his body began its rapid, catastrophic decomposition. Despite their best efforts, the embalmers were overwhelmed by the enormity, literally, of the task before them. Henry's body, bloated to nearly 400 pounds, was already saturated with infection and toxins. His ulcers, gangrenous and crawling with pus, had poisoned every vein. Within hours of death, his abdomen swelled monstrously with gas, his skin stretched tight, and blisters the size of fists erupted across his flesh. The physicians stuffed the corpse with spices, wine, and sawdust, but nothing could mask the stench. It poured through the palace, a sickly, sweet rot that clung to walls, curtains, clothing. Servants wept openly from the smell alone. Still, the machinery of monarchy demanded ritual. His coffin, an enormous construction of lead and wood, was prepared to carry the body from Whitehall to Windsor. The journey was meant to be solemn, stately, dignified. Instead, it became the final humiliation of Henry VIII. For on the road to Windsor, at the Abbey of Sion, disaster struck. As the coffin rested overnight, the gases building within Henry's monstrous corpse could no longer be contained. The lead casing buckled, and, with a horrifying crack, the coffin burst open. Black, putrid fluid gushed onto the floor, the liquefied remains of the king's innards spilling out like a burst sewer. Eyewitnesses recoiled in horror. Priests crossed themselves. Some fainted. And then came the most grotesque image of all. Stray dogs crept into the abbey and lapped at the king's fluids, drinking from the remains of England's once mighty monarch. To those present, it seemed like divine judgment. The mighty king who had defied the Pope, who had crowned and discarded wives, who had styled himself as God's anointed, now reduced to dog's meat, carrion in a broken box. Rumors spread like wildfire. Preachers whispered that it fulfilled the prophecy made by Franciscan friars that Henry, for his crimes against the church, would become food for dogs. The court scrambled to suppress the story. Official chroniclers were ordered to describe a peaceful death, a solemn lying in state, a perfect embalming. The truth was locked away, hidden in the margins of private diaries and in the hushed whispers of servants. But the reality was undeniable. By the time Henry's remains finally reached Windsor and were buried at St. George's Chapel, his body was no longer that of a man, but of a rotted, leaking carcass. His grave was meant to be temporary, awaiting the grand tomb he had designed for himself, a monument of gold, jewels, and triumph. That tomb was never built. Instead, England's most infamous king lies in a plain vault beneath the chapel floor, crammed in beside the coffin of Jane Seymour, his true queen. No golden effigy, no marble canopy, just a name carved in stone centuries later, barely marking his place. The man who once commanded all of Europe's fear and envy now lies anonymously in the dust. His legacy overshadowed not by glory, but by rot, madness, and horror.
And that is the forbidding truth of Henry VIII's death, not the sanitized myth of a powerful monarch passing peacefully into history, but the grotesque collapse of a man destroyed by his own violence, his own appetites, his own sins. The Golden Prince who became a tyrant. The king who defied Rome and butchered his wives. The monarch whose body betrayed him, whose mind collapsed into madness, and whose corpse was so corrupted it burst its coffin open for dogs to devour. This is not the Henry VIII of school books. This is not the Henry of sanitized portraits and museum tours. This is the Henry they tried to erase from history. Because in the end, kings do not die like gods. They die like men. And sometimes they die like monsters. If this dark journey through the life and death of Henry VIII shook you, make sure to subscribe to My Thorax for more hidden truths they don't teach in school. Hit that like button if you stayed with me to the end, and share this with a friend who still thinks history is boring. Because as you now know, history is not boring. History is blood, rot, and secrets. And this was the darkest secret of them all.